Gwylliaid Cochion Mawddwy, and I welcome you all back to Wales. Now before I start this video and invite you to listen to the tales that are tied to the land here, I'd like you all to humour me. And if you can, I want you all to cast your mind and put yourself into a situation where you live in a remote location. And now I mean a remote to the truest aspect of that word, where the mountains and its weather, the changing seasons very much dictate whether you ate or starved. In a land that invites cruel men that reflect the wild and the harsh reality of that landscape. I want you to imagine that you live in high mountains, or which overshadows the ungodly activities that hinder the outside world from knowing what inflicts you. I want you to imagine that you live in a lawless land where authority and order is as common as a summer's day in Wales. Are you there yet? Because if you are now in the mindset and the reality of the people that called Dinas Mawddwy their home in their 1500s. Now, Dinas Mawddwy today is very much a passing destination. In fact, most people that tread this land take the high mountain road to go to Diolch and then on to Barmouth, where they can enjoy the sea air of the Irish Sea and the Welsh coastal regions. But way back into the 1500s, this road would have been unwise to travel along. And those that would have taken it would have either had a concealed weapon or been up there for a more sinister purpose. Now, there was an old saying that comes from Dinas Mawddwy that was very much held by most locals that lived in this part of mid-Wales. Twi beth o farwi o'r hawr, Dunclas, Nolclas on gawr. And in English roughly translates, there are three things that come from Mawddwy. And that is cruel men, a nasty gawr, and rain. Now this very much reflects the ideology and the mindset that people had for this region of Meiriolaeth. And you can understand when you come here and you take this old mountain road, that this location is seen as a great opportunity for those who want to live by the Taker's Creed. Now, there are many different reasons why people took to highway robbery back then. Lack of opportunity, stealing something very benign but warranted a crime or punishment too great for what you've done. For example, stealing a loaf of bread and possibly being hanged for it. But this region of Wales did not just attract people that were hard on luck and had to take to the highway road. It was known that the men that lived in these mountains had a lack of morals and enjoyed physical torment of those that they robbed. And the road that many people take these days to get to Diolch onto Barmouth was one of the main roads that had frequent attacks on traders, merchants, or lone travellers. Now you can see by the landscape here why robbers and highwaymen would choose this location to hide and to rob passageways down below, especially if they're popular. Because this landscape, again, is a valley. You can see how steep it is to travel, how thick it is in forest. But mind you, it would most likely have been different sort of trees. But it was easy for these robbers to run and hide from those that would put them in chains. And it was a death sentence for those who would chase them. Because if they come in here to try and capture those that have done wrong, you could end up having your throat cut. But there was one group of highwaymen, robbers and thieves, that struck fear even to the hardest robber that would roam here. This group of bandits were known as the Gwylliaid Cochion. the Red Bandits of Mawddwy. Now this group of bandits gained such a vile reputation that farmers high up in the mountains, isolated away from communities, with sharpened stakes, placed them at the base of their fire pit to avoid any intruder from coming down their chimney. Because this in particular group were known to enter your home by any means necessary. And not only would they rob you, they'll take advantage of your ladies, as well as possibly slitting your throat to avoid any repercussions. And not only that, people would rarely leave their villages. And if they did, they wouldn't go far without a concealed weapon. And they wouldn't even take the mountain routes. They would deliberately go around the valleys, take longer in their days to avoid any violent altercations. It was also known that safety came in numbers, and travelling alone was a foolish errand. Now the reason why they were known as Red Shanks is because of the characterisation of how they looked. They were fierce looking people. They were known to have devilish blue eyes, and their thick beards and long hair were as red and as wild as the bloody deeds they committed upon the people that travelled along the roads. They were even said to have their own language, something far older than Welsh, and nothing that any Englishman would have heard before. This rose to the rise of the belief that they were not from this world, and due to the deeds that they committed, many thought they were truly demons and were summoned from the darkest pits of the mountains. And these Red Shank bandits very much dominated the highway scene around Dinas Mawddwy. Their reputation started to become more brutal, and the word of these demons with red hair and blue eyes soon started to pass through Wales like wildfire. Stories and gossip were being told in inns, halfway houses throughout Wales. And before too long, the authorities at Aberystwyth were gaining complaints about the brutality that is coming from this region of Wales. With the gossip, stories, and people starting questioning why such brutality could be lingering for so long, the authorities started to gain a cold shiver of fear. Their authority would probably be next to be questioned for not being able to put down such horrific scenes high up in these Welsh mountains. But also, the authorities could not allow a region which is so difficult to control to become a haven for outlaws. So word was soon spread and passed towards Westminster, and the Crown Court commissioned a man to become the Sheriff of Meirionydd with one purpose and one purpose only: to put down the tyranny of these blue-eyed, red-faced devils. Now, the individual that was given this duty was a man known as Baron Lewis Owen. And by all accounts, he was a bit of a tyrant himself, cruel in nature, but hard and brutal. I guess the thinking was, to fight brutality, you needed to use brutal men. So Baron Lewis Owen started by commissioning buildings of new gallows in all major towns in this region of Wales. He also commissioned mercenaries and people that knew the land well to be able to track these outlaws and find the encampments so they can tie him in chains and bring him to the noose. In the process of the hunt for these outlaws, the Baron started to stoke the fear that was already felt by the many that inhabited this land. By doing so, he gained more sympathy, more donations to pump into this quest to bring down order into Dinas Mawddwy. And over time, they started to find encampments of other highwaymen and outlaws. Each man they found, each woman they found, they tied them in chains and brought them to whatever region of Wales to meet the hangman's noose. And many a hanging was seen in this region of Wales. But each man and each woman that felt that rope tighten to Lord Baron Lewis Owen, it was an outlaw no longer causing him grief. But for every outlaw that felt the hangman's noose, none of them were red-faced or blue-eyed demons. In fact, the Red Bandits were still causing grief. They were thieving, robbing and murdering throughout the mountains. And over time, people started asking questions whether this Baron was truly up to task. The pressure is now on. Now with pressure mounting and questions being asked by his superiors, he needed to start gaining some results. But lucky enough, that afternoon he came across a young farmhand that told him stories of mountain fire. Mountain fire that appears when the night is at its darkest. So Lord Baron ordered all his men to sharpen their blades and prepare for combat and get ready for a long night of hiking. Now the track that this young lad took them was not a pretty one. In fact, most of the locals that joined this war band grew out of stories about this forest with throat cutters, changelings and spirits that were very ill in nature. It all added to that fear factor of these Red Bandits of Mawddwy. But as they got higher, they started to see an orange glow, and before them was a rather large encampment. This encampment was the size of a small community, but one thing the Baron did notice was the red hair. Women, children, the men all had this distinct red hair. So as they slept, Baron ordered the swords to be drawn, and a bloody altercation followed that order. The violence was heavy, and these Red Bandits truly gained a reputation well. They were strong and fierce, and despite being woken up from their slumber, they gave a grand fight, but they were heavily outnumbered. They were all dragged from their women, from their children as they slept, cast into chains, and dragged down that mountain for the last time. Word quickly spread throughout Wales that these red-faced demons of Mawddwy were caught and would soon meet their makers by the hangman's noose. So towns throughout Wales, wherever there was a gallows erected, soon swell with people wanting to see these demons from the descriptions and the horror stories that were passed down for either half or in. But on the morning of the hanging, the weather was that typical Welsh style. In fact, walking along the scaffold was just as dangerous as walking Dinas Mawddwy when the Red Bandits were at the height of their murderous spree. A large crowd came that day to watch these thieving beggars dance the hangman's jig. And within the crowd, concealing the colour of their hair, was the women that bred and supported this murderous reign. And throughout that morning, the crowd watched on as each man, highwayman, outlaw and petty thief danced the hangman's jig. But before long, one of the famous Red Shank Devils stood on the scaffolding. Tall, broad and menacing looking he was. And he stared down the Sheriff of Merioneth. With one nod of the Sheriff, this Baron who was charged to put these men to the end, the first of the bandits dropped. But what followed was a sickening sound. This bandit's neck jolted with a rope and sent a sound that even erupted the hardened stomachs of those in the crowd. It was said some threw up their morning broth. The sight and the sound that echoed from that scaffolding. But the trauma of the crowd did not last long. They stayed and continued watching each of these red bandits drop, and each watched their necks break. And despite the wailing and the crying of the women that were akin to these bandits, the Baron in charge of this bloody execution watched on. But even the crowd stopped and pondered when the last two of these bandits came to the scaffolding. The two individuals barely looked like bandits. Yes, they had red hair, but they were not broad. They barely had any whiskers upon their chin. It looked as if they barely saw 13 winters. They were young lads and were stoked in fear, calling out for their mother, of which was in the crowd. The railing was so horrifying that even people in the crowd started questioning the Baron's judgment in hanging two that are so young. The mother of the young condemned burst out in a fierce rage. She managed to get through the security of this Baron and laid to her knees and begged for mercy, prayed to whatever God he believed in to show some kindness. But she received none. The Baron scoffed and with one strike pushed her down to the floor, or with his boot on her cheek made her watch her two sons drop and then dangle in the wind. It is said the Baron whispered in her ear, "I was in charge by the state to end your family's reign of terror. And now that your sons' necks are broken, my job is now done." As Lord Baron retired, Lowry ripped open her dress and bare-chested screamed to the Baron, "These breasts gave life, but with these hands I cupped them with, I will soon bathe in your blood." The Baron scoffed, laughed, and ventured in to the inn where he continued an evening of drinking and celebration. It is true to say that the Lord Baron brought law and order once again to Dinas Mawddwy. However, within the mountains, there were those that still held a bitter resentment for the hanging display of their kin. A man called Goch John and the woman, Lowry Davis, Lowry Goch, charged themselves to seek out bloody revenge, and they did. On the mountain road made famous by these red bandits, or where many a bloody altercation occurred, the Lord Baron Sheriff of Merioneth was travelling with a company of men. And as he was at the pass where the Bulch meets, an enclave of arrows fell upon him and his company. Before long, his men could not defend themselves. He was left wounded, surrounded by dead men. As he arose, he saw behind the rocks red-haired women with devilish blue eyes approaching his body with sharp knives and leather-bound rope. He dragged his helpless body deep into the woodlands. They bound him tight to an oak tree. And out from the woodland came the same woman that pleaded for mercy. And as the Baron was gagged, he watched on as Lowry drew a knife and approached him. It is said on certain times of the year, you can still hear this Baron scream out into the mountains as the red-headed women mutilated his body. The Sheriff of Merioneth, the man responsible for the destruction of the Red Bandits, was left to bleed out and put on display on the highway road. The suitable arrests were made. Larry and the men that were responsible for his murder were put on trial in Barra. But Larry escaped the hangman's noose. She claimed that she was a spinster, pregnant, or with an examination of women of her peer. They made the statement to be true. So the others that were hanged, Larry was free to go. And all accounts and documentation of her disappeared in time. So it is highly likely that the descendants of these devilish, blue-eyed, red-faced devils might still be roaming the mountains of Dinas Mawddwy.